In particular, liberalism emphasizes individual rights, emphasizes holding leaders accountable, putting constraints on power, because all leaders have to be held accountable, and it, in many ways, has much to commend it. Liberal states tend to be economically more prosperous, certainly have better human rights records, and on many other measures, life expectancy, education, and other things like that, liberal societies do remarkably well. Then the question becomes, why is the liberal model in such trouble today? We've seen democracy break down in a number of other countries. We've seen authoritarian governments prove surprisingly resilient in a number of places. We've seen divisions occurring in a number of liberal societies and the rise of far-right movements in a variety of places. And even in my own country, we've seen the election of a president whose commitment to liberal principles seems to be very thin, and who may in fact be in the process of triggering a constitutional crisis. So the question is, if liberalism has all these virtues, what's gone wrong in the last 25 years? And I think there are 4 or 5 big problems. First of all, there was a sense of hubris about the liberal model. Here in Europe, for example, the European Union kept expanding without, I think, much careful thought, created the euro for part of Europe, which was ultimately not a good idea and has caused enormous problems in the wake of the financial crisis. In the United States, of course, hubris took the form of trying to spread democracy all over the world, peacefully if possible, but if necessary by military force, leading to adventures such as our foolish invasion of Iraq. And those things, I think, have helped weaken and discredit the liberal model. A second problem was to ignore the downside of globalization. There are many benefits to globalization. Around the world, more than 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty as a result of it. It has made goods cheaper. It has had, again, many positive features. But it also has various downsides. It can be disruptive to certain parts of society. And as globalization occurred throughout the world, some groups did very well by it. Elites did very well by it, but some groups within society did poorly, and the elites that were in charge didn't recognize what these destabilizing consequences might be. A third problem, and it follows from the second one, is a lack of accountability. Many of the people who are responsible for some of the problems of globalization, such as the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, or events like the war in Iraq, were never really held accountable for it. People didn't lose their jobs for making these mistakes. People responsible continued to be wealthy, respected members of society, and many of them never even acknowledged that they had made errors as well. Over time, the view that elites in many parts of the West were out of touch with the rest of society made it possible for populists like Donald Trump and others to rise to power, and made things like the British decision to leave the European Union look like an attractive decision rather than a foolish mistake. Number 4, liberals forgot about nationalism. There was a belief that over time, as liberalism spread around the world, gradually people would lose their national identities and become part of a broad liberal global community. Borders wouldn't matter very much, and local identities and loyalties would no longer be important. And I think this proved to be premature at best and just dead wrong at worst. We see everywhere around the world that nationalism and other forms of local identity are a powerful social force and leading to things like the Brexit decision or some of the rise of right-wing xenophobia here in Europe. It's also been, of course, a key part of the resistance to Western interference in places like Iraq, Syria, or Afghanistan, not to mention Libya. And then finally, I think we assumed that the liberal model was so desirable that it was nearly inevitable and that events would never move back the other direction. We forgot that liberal leaders in liberal country might be just as fond of power as anyone else and start using the institutions of a liberal society to actually keep themselves in power and to threaten liberalism itself. Again, I think we've seen this happen in a number of other places. Well, the question is, given these problems, what is to be done? Obviously not abandon the liberal model at this moment. It still has much to commend it, and we actually need to be defending it more vigorously rather than trying to dilute it or compromise it at this point. But at the same time, we need to be wary of too much zeal. That is to say, energetic efforts to try and spread liberalism all over the world, to try and accelerate this process, and especially if it's done with military force, tend to backfire and in turn cause further problems for liberal societies. So we want to defend the ideal, but we want to have sufficient confidence in liberal values to be patient and let them develop slowly and organically rather than imposing them upon others. And then finally, it follows from what I just said that the best thing liberal societies can do is set a good example. If liberal societies look like better places to live, if they are indeed more prosperous, more open, more free than others, then other societies will look at us and want to have something like that for themselves. Ironically, the best way to defend and strengthen liberalism abroad is to strengthen liberal societies at home. In other words, the open society at home is the best way to spread an open society abroad.